Welcome to everybody to another episode of the Global Health Education Summit. We are so excited to be with you. It is June of 2021 and we are back at the tipping point of all things. And every month that goes by, it feels like more and more urgency is present in the environment. We have a more and more polarized population that we've ever experienced. And this is both at the social level, the economic level around the world, with the massive amount of poverty we've created over the last year and a half of this international lockdown, 150 to 300 million new families in poverty right now. We have a crisis of social unrest. We have incredible political polarization that is perhaps as severe as it's ever been in this nation's history, but it has certainly trickled into almost every Western nation now with this intense degree of angst and conflict. At this same moment, we layer into that the fear tactics around our health crisis, and the pandemic has put an exclamation point on the frailty and vulnerability of the human biology as it stands today. We are not as resilient as we were just 8 years ago with the last coronavirus that went around the world in 2012 with MERS. And we're certainly in a radically different place than the first SARS coronavirus out of Asia in 2002. And so as these viruses have cropped up every 8 to 10 years, what is happening is not so much an increase in virulence of the viruses, but an increased vulnerability in our population. And so with the continued aging of some populations in some sectors of the world, as well as the collapse of the immune system in younger and younger people in developed nations, we have created vulnerabilities that simply didn't exist. It's easy to blame that some sort of mortality, no matter how you want to count that mortality, on a virus. It's easy to externalize our problems. But if you've ever done any work in communications or couples therapy or whatever thing you can think of that's corporate communication, what you find out first is the only way to resolve crisis is to realize that you are 100% responsible for your experience. Finding external causes to blame for your experience is a fatal error that is made all of the time in relationships, in corporate settings, in political settings, as well as, of course, in this health setting, when we start to externalize and rationalize our experience by external factors. We are 100% responsible as humanity for the vulnerabilities we've created within ourselves. And it is tragic that we are not only creating those vulnerabilities in ourselves, but we're destroying the ecosystems around us and dragging life on Earth with us into this great extinction event. What it means when we start to look at those extinction pathways, from whether it be our fertility markers with sperm counts dropping 57% over the last 40 years in Western countries, or the explosion of chronic disease starting in the mid-1990s and extending till today, this is the time when everything is at its tipping point. Over those last 40 years, we've lost half of life on Earth. 50% of life on Earth has disappeared. We're losing one species every 20 minutes. This extremity of our situation, we need to take responsibility for. We cannot blame it on CO2 in the atmosphere. We cannot blame it on viruses circulating around the planet. It is time for us to take 100% responsibility for the exploitation, the destructive and consumptive nature of our species, and we need to reinvent everything. When you start to imagine what it's going to look like to reinvent humanity to avoid this extinction event, we have to change in such a short timeline. We got 8-10 years to fundamentally change our relationship to soil, water, and air systems to prevent some catastrophic events happening in ocean acidification, like 8 to 10 years. We have such precious little time to fundamentally change the trajectory. We have set in motion time bombs within our genetics with the exposure to DDT in the 1950s, to the advent of the organophosphates in the 1970s with Roundup and Glyphosate. We know the generational time bomb has been put in. In the generational studies of animals, we can show that the third generation born after that initial exposure has catastrophic results in fertility, cancer, autoimmunity, and the like. We haven't birthed the third generation of Roundup babies yet. And so we don't even know how hot the water is going to get just with the toxicity that we've already baked in. And now in the last 2 years, we've seen approvals for multi-herbicide resistant seeds in our food system. We are literally spraying 2,4-D, dicamba, and glyphosate onto the same seeds, onto the same crops that will go into your children's mouths this year. So we are triple dosing, and now there's a 5-toxin seed that's being put on the market in the next 12 months that will allow for 5 toxins that disrupt biology to be put into our food system simultaneously. This is the stew that we've created from a food system standpoint that is poisoning the health of the planet. These are the kinds of data points that we need to sit with for a moment to recognize this is the hospice moment. This is the moment where we have to come to terms with death. We have to come to terms with the end of things, or we need to rewrite the future. And to rewrite the future, we are going to need the most creative brains that have ever happened in humanity. And that's why we're here today. I could not be more excited to have Kristen with us today. Dr. Kristen, I'm going to mess up her name right now because we talked about 3 versions of her last name, but the French there is Willeumier, which I love. So Dr. Kristen Willeumier is an incredible scientist in the neuro field and is the author of The Brain Hack. Wow, I'm really butchering this one here. Hack Your Brain by Dr. Kristen Willeumier. And Kristen is with us to start to share her journey of how she sees the potential of the human brain to be captured in a different way than perhaps we've described our potential, and to set us free into this new potential of creativity. So Dr. Kristen, we're so excited to have you here with us. We're excited for you to give us the meandering journey of your career and how you come to this potential that you outlined in your book here, which is really giving us a glimpse of the fact that we have untapped potential here in the brain. And we tend to look at life as a series of traumas, and we mark out the decrement of our neural function or our biologic function in the aging process. But you've done something amazing with you and your colleagues, really exploring the possibility of regeneration of the brain and setting us into this creative space on perhaps a level we've never been able to experience before. So thank you so much for being with us. So excited to have you here and for your wisdom to get into this audience. But give us a little bit of that meandering journey that you've taken us through with your life journey.
Well, Zach, it is truly such a pleasure to be here with you today in your global community. It is a true honor. So thank you to be here with you and Dr. Pete Cummings and your wonderful staff. So a little bit of my background, and I will tell you to start with, the reason why I'm here is I'm so passionate about what is possible in terms of brain restoration and regeneration. And as Zach has said, you know, there's so much fear right now coming out of the global pandemic, and fear can really impact our neural structures. And there's so many things that are occurring in our brain that are really helping to offset the aging process. So I want to be here and share some of the wisdom that I've learned with my colleagues, teaching you guys how to take the best care of your brain health. So a little bit of my background. I'm going to go back to childhood. So I started showing horses at the age of 7. I grew up in the Midwest, beautiful horse country, and I spent 10 years as an athlete competing in the hunters and jumpers. And the reason why I bring this up in my brain health journey is at that point in time, I had actually experienced a number of subconcussive impacts and head impacts from falling off of my horses. Never realizing that there would be a certain point in my career where I would come back and end up working with athletes who have traumatic brain injuries and helping them to restore and rehabilitate brain function. So that was the first part. You know, when I finished competing, I actually went off to Boston College and got a degree in psychology. And that's where really I got intrigued in the study of the mind. And I studied cognitive mapping behaviors in individuals. But I was also intrigued to see if I could connect sports and sports psychology and the study of the mind with enhancing the mind and performance enhancement. So that was my initial foray into science. I quickly learned that I wanted to dig deeper. As many people who, you know, begin the study of scientific inquiry, when you start to scratch the surface, there are so many unanswered questions. And I really wanted to get deeper into the physiology of the brain. So in 1998, I went off to graduate school over at UCLA. Yes, I went to graduate school in the 90s. I'm feeling very old here. And I did a master's degree in, got a master's degree in physiological science, and I studied in a laboratory of neuroendocrinology, studying how hormones impact brain function in animal models. I then continued on and did a master's degree and PhD in the Department of Neurobiology at the David Geffen School of Medicine over at UCLA. And concurrently, I did graduate and postgraduate training in the Department of Neurology over at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in the field of neurodegenerative diseases, neurogenetics. So I studied a gene that is implicated in the young onset form of Parkinson's disease, known as PARP2. And I studied it at the level of the single cell, because that's what we do as neurobiologists. You know, the brain is this extraordinary organ, right, comprised of 86 billion neurons. Each one of those neurons can make up to 10,000 to 40,000 synaptic connections. So you've got trillions of synaptic connectivity going on there. But when I was in the laboratory setting, here I was studying at the level of the single cell and really understanding why the disease process happens. So in this case, with the mutations in Parkin leading to the young onset form of Parkinson's disease. When I finished my graduate and postgraduate training, I decided to go more into translational medicine. So I took a position with the Amen Clinics as their director of neuroimaging research. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Amen Clinics, they are an outpatient psychiatric center that specializes in the treatment of complex psychiatric disorders. So people who would come to our clinics on average had 3 to 4 psychiatric diagnoses and were on 5 to 6 medications and had typically failed 3 previous treatment providers. So we were the location people came to use neuroimaging to help in the targeted treatment of psychiatric disorders. And this is really what opened my eyes to the possibility of precision medicine, as well as using neuroimaging as a way to help guide and target treatment for our patients so that they had improved qualities of life. We essentially take the guesswork out of what medications or supplements to use and really studied the specific neurobiological correlates of different psychiatric diseases like anxiety, depression, ADHD, bipolar disorder, autism. In addition, to holding that position. So I ran all of our clinical neuroimaging trials. I was also the director of nutrition and nutraceuticals, which was really fun. So I was able to essentially test the efficacy of using certain brain nutraceuticals using sophisticated neuroimaging technologies like quantitative EEG and functional imaging. So really the first 10 years of my career were spent in academia in a laboratory setting. The second 10 years of my career have really been spent now in the clinical setting, doing more translational medicine. And one of the more revelatory studies that we did over at the Amen Clinics was assessing the impact of playing collision-based sports, namely professional football, and the long-term impact on brain function. And again, so that's sort of circling back to my initial time, being a competitive equestrian, having had tons of repetitive subconcussive impacts, and never really realizing the potential long-term effects on my own brain function. And here I was now working in a clinical setting, studying this question in professional athletes. We were doing it at a time back in 2009 before people were really talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy in football players. And why all of this is important is because this particular group, and the NFL players, tend to have neurodegenerative diseases at 3 times the level of that of the general population. So we have these damage to brain function, the very delicate neural structures in the brain. And without a thoughtful, proactive approach to take care of the brain, These particular athletes are really showing changes in cognition and behavior that are happening earlier in life. So if we see neurodegenerative changes happening in the brain of a normal person, that tends to happen in the 6th and 7th decade of life. But for athletes who are playing these sports, we're seeing them a little bit earlier, and they're really impacting their day-to-day quality of life. So one of the more important things my colleagues and I started to do was assess how can we rehabilitate brain function. And we can go into that work later on our discussion, but I just wanted to point out that was really the impetus for the next 10 years of my work. What kind of things that we could do with our professional athletes to help restore and rehabilitate their brain function. We were able to show we could do this using clinical neuroimaging, which is really extraordinary in my eyes, because when you have a map of the brain and you can see before and after, doing basic dietary and lifestyle interventions practiced consistently can effectively change brain structure and function, and you can maintain that as you age. And for me, that was such a revelatory moment, and it was also in our clinical setting, because we took those rehabilitation strategies and we're also using them for patients with mild cognitive impairment and dementia. So you can see it can be as simple as doing dietary and lifestyle approaches. It can be as complex as using neurofeedback, transcranial magnetic stimulation, hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So we have all of these extraordinary tools available in the clinical setting, but we have so many tools in our everyday life that we can do through the foods we eat, the thoughts we think, how much restorative sleep we get, how much exercise we get on a daily basis. And we all know and hear these things, but coming from a clinical research standpoint where it's measurable and we can actually see these changes in brain function, I kind of think of myself now as one of the cheerleaders for brain health and really wanting to get people excited about the things that they can do and empower them with the things that they can do daily, so that these degenerative diseases that are appearing in our 6th, 7th, and 8th decade of life, we know we need to start taking care of the brain as soon as possible, because these degenerative changes happen at the cellular level 20 years before you have a symptom. And I know you know this, Zach, and Dr. Pete is probably aware of it, but I don't know that people in the general population are really aware of it. And to really take this story to the next level, when we're on a career path, there's that saying in the universe, we make plans and God laughs, or the universe laughs. So here I was studying Parkinson's disease back in graduate school, only to have my own father 10 years later start to have early symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Started in his 50s, accelerated over time. He actually got the diagnosis in his 70s, but by the time he had the diagnosis, he was already struggling with his ability to walk. He was falling. The early stages were happening when he was 50 and he had the tremors. So, that really opened my eyes to the fact that I am here for a reason. I've seen this in my father. To let your audience know one really interesting thing about my dad. So he was a combat helicopter pilot back in Vietnam in the 60s. So he was in the jungles of Vietnam, exposed to Agent Orange. He did 2 tours in Vietnam, flew 600 missions. So there's trauma, there's exposure to pesticides. Then he leaves, becomes a pilot for Pan American. So he flew internationally, exposed to more fumes, right, exhaust from the airplanes. And at the same time, he had a second career as a fireman for 30 years. So he was also exposing himself yet again to everything: smoke, carbon monoxide poisoning, asbestos, petrochemicals, everything that firefighters get exposed to. So my father is very healthy, tall, thin, 6'4", healthy body mass index, didn't drink, didn't smoke, on no medications, no family history of psychiatric issues. His parents lived to 92 and 95. His grandfather lived to 101. But here he was at 50, with the start of the degenerative changes. So I share this story with you to say that, through my work, in Parkinson's, through the experience of my father, watching him go through the changes and pass away 2017, and then through my work with the professional athletes, where the studies we've done have been in hundreds of athletes. And I've basically watched the population that I started working with back in 2009. I've watched some of our players get diagnosed with ALS, Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's. So it was sort of longitudinally watching the players change and noting the importance of the things that they could do. I mean, part of why I wrote the book is I just wanted to empower people with the things that we were doing with our athlete population, how to take better care of their brain health. Yes, some of them are still going to get these degenerative changes. We know that the research literature is supporting that, but we can slow that process down. And I've seen in the clinical setting, we always say, you are not stuck with the brain you have. You can make it better, and you can make it better in a very short period of time. We've shown clinically we can do it within a 6-month period of time, but imagine the changes that you can make when you do it consistently over time. So I will stop here.
That is beautiful. I love that trajectory and winding path. I wonder if we could, take a look at, some of these things. I'm eager to get to the lifestyle stuff, of course, as to kind of how do we biohack our brain on a daily basis here, as you've outlined in your book, but also want to think about just like that extraordinary situation of birth to, 2 years old, so that how as parents do we start to reimagine, or how as a society do we start to reimagine a different fostering of brain potential in those first couple of years, because we're actually born with an extraordinary amount of neurologic, reservoir that we pare back quite quickly. Can you take us through that journey?
Yeah, well, that's such a great start to the dialogue, because really it's from birth, actually pre-birth, right in the womb, what mothers are eating and thinking, like the stress that a mom is having during birth can get transmitted to the child. So we have to be so aware and cognizant of everything that's coming in through our external environment. But from birth all the way through 5 years of age, there is this rapid, like explosive amount of neuronal growth in the brain. This is why they say young kids, you can expose them to various languages and they can pick it up easily, just because the brain is in this growth phase. And through the growth phase, that's where the learning happens. So exposing your children to different languages can be really important at a young age. The things that you say, the sounds that are in their environment are really important. Kids are picking up information like a little sponge. Now, they don't come online. Their brains really, from a conscious perspective, start to come online more when they're older, right? Between that period of 8 to 10 years of age. But when they're young, they're just picking up everything from their environment. So again, it's the things that we say, it's the foods that we feed them, it's the amount of stimulation that we give them. It's like you could put your child in a Montessori school starting at age 1 year old and start exposing them to new learning. And Montessori is wonderful because that is unstructured learning and it's creative. So it allows the child to go sort of intuitively to the things that they find will help stimulate their growth. And, something that I think is really important to share, and a lot of people don't always know about this, is the brain is going through this growth phase from birth, right, from in the womb all the way up until we hit about age 25. Our brain is not fully mature until we are age 25. So sometimes we wonder when children get into their teenage years, right, they don't seem to have a hold of their emotions. We're talking about mental health issues now in kids. Well, their brain is not fully formed, and the frontal lobes of the brain really don't start to fully develop until their late teens and 20s. And we need the frontal lobes to make great decisions. So that's why we say parents really need to be there to help guide their children from birth all the way until their mid-20s, believe it or not. So your parental duties do not end, at age 17, 18, or 21. We need you there.
I love that. I love that. And as we kind of step through that journey of those kind of creative opportunities that we have, one of the more fascinating things for me as an endocrinologist is looking at the difference in the sexes with the brains and the way in which they develop. And so at the time of menarche for women, you're looking at these young women between 11 and 13 now, getting younger and younger as the endocrine system gets stressed. We have precocious puberty. So we have some girls having periods as early as 9 years old, but suffice to say, whether it be 9, 13, or 15 that those first menses happen, that estrogen cycling has such a profound effect on dendritic sprouting, or the ways in which the branches of the trees can connect there in the brain. And so I'm fascinated by not only these kind of longer phases that you described there, like those creative moments, the sponge of the 2-year-old brain, the creative burst of the 8-year-old brain, the capacity for information synthesis and pattern recognition in our teens, into that kind of complex decision-making executive function of the frontal lobes by the time we're in our 20s. Those journeys are also punctuated by these monthly cycles, especially for women, as estrogen progesterone cycles occur, where you get these new opportunities for creativity. And so one of my favorite things to talk about for women, especially in my clinics full of women going through menopause and struggling with those changes, but also women going through pregnancy and feeling that mommy brain kind of effect, where suddenly they're like, why is my brain not working? And I can't think of words, and I can't do this, and I'm confused, leaving everything around that mommy brain effect, as well as that moment of transition of estrogen progesterone cycles through menopause. At each of these points, there's a neuro opportunity, and I really try to emphasize that the shift that you're going through is 100% hormonal foundation in it, but there's a lot of potential in there to think and act differently on the tail end of that transition. What are your thoughts on that, or what have you seen in the neuroimaging world?
Yeah, that's, you bring up a great point. I think the way that I've looked at it, from my experience, is that we're looking at what happens hormonally. So you talk about estrogen being really important to help neuronal growth and synaptic plasticity, and that's really important, which is why when women hit menopause, perimenopause, and menopause, you start to see some people have brain fog, and it's due to the changing levels of the estrogen and the progesterone. So with the progesterone, we like that because it helps, it's sort of nature's natural anxiety reliever. So we use progesterone to help calm the brain down. The estrogen is really helping against synaptic growth and plasticity. So for people who are going through that menopausal state, it's important to make sure we regulate and keep the hormones balanced.
Yeah, I love the opportunities that we have around this kind of changing neural environment in children right now. We see a spike in ADHD and autism spectrum disorders right now. And the unique things about these children that I see in my clinic is that even as we start to support their health and healing through gut health and through the gut-brain axis, and start to change their sensory input so that they can handle the day in a more effective way and get them out of kind of their traumatic experience of that neural shift or neural injury, we see that their brains cannot be programmed with the current paradigm. And to the last kid, they seem to have these superpowers, each kid slightly different than the other, but their superpowers are so unique in that they see the world so fundamentally different. They sense the world in more energetic ways than they perhaps do visually. They can feel emotion, they can see emotion in different ways than the rest of us and the like. And so do you have any thoughts around, where we're going as a society, perhaps, when we see, 1 in 5 kids with ADHD, and by 2035 we may be seeing 1 in 3 children with some sort of autism spectrum? What does that look like from a neuroimaging standpoint? What parts of the brain seem to be really freed up in these children with these spectrum disorders?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. Well, one thing I like to teach people about ADHD is that it is a childhood disorder, and some people can actually grow out of it by the time they're in their mid-20s. So what we see on neuroimaging is when somebody tries to do a focusing task. So we can do brain imaging while they do what's called a Conners continuous performance test. It's a test of a focus and attention. And what we do is we see the frontal lobe function drop. So we see low blood flow in the prefrontal cortex. That probably means low amounts of dopamine, and we need that dopamine to help with focus. But I also like to say, and I love that you brought this up, that I never look at a diagnosis as a diagnosis. I look at it as an opportunity of where we can harness strengths. And with ADHD, I think one of the wonderful strengths is the creativity. In the clinic, we like to call it the shiny ball syndrome because, you know, sometimes the kids get very distracted and it's hard to stay on point with one thing. Although you will find that their focus and attention can be quite directed at things they are passionate in. It's just not always focused when there are things that they don't want to do or not passionate in, or they might have to wait and procrastinate. So one of the key things that we see with ADHD is that procrastination to get something done, then they do it and get that big dopamine hit, which allows them to focus. So, everybody's brain is unique. That's one thing after seeing thousands of brain scans, no two brains are alike. And again, 86 billion neurons, trillions of connections. There's different types of ADHD. There's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's inattentive ADD. And then there's what we call combined, which is inattentive and hyperactive. And there are different brain regions that are involved. One thing that I love to tell parents about is we use in the clinical setting quantitative EEG, where we can put a cap on the head and measure the brainwave activities. And we can see the very specific patterns that are dysfunctional in somebody that has ADHD. Typically, we will see elevations in the theta brainwaves. So theta are your daydreaming brainwaves. And again, to Zach's point, you bring up creativity. I think something that goes hand in hand with ADHD is the creative mind. We've taught adults who come into our clinic how to effectively utilize their ADHD to their advantage. And what this means is, so people with ADHD sometimes have a hard time organizing things. So you start to make lists, right? So you're more organized, or you have, a person who is what we call your prefrontal cortex to help you get things done during the day. But there's also, you can use nutritional supplements to help boost dopamine in the brain. You can use food, high protein foods in the morning and protein shakes to help boost dopamine in the brain. You can do neurofeedback. So I was talking about quantitative EEG, which will give us a very specific brain map on how your child's brain is wired and how ADHD manifests. And then we can use neurofeedback, which is a form of operant conditioning that allows the brain to retrain itself. So the brain is this extraordinary organ that's always wanting to learn. And what neurofeedback does, we liken it to going to the gym for your brain. So just like you go to the gym and do a bicep curl, or you're working legs, what you do is you don't just go once, you go for a month. You might do 20 sessions at the gym or 30 sessions, and then all of a sudden you see muscles. Well, it's the same thing with neurofeedback. We can have somebody do 20 to 30 sessions of neurofeedback. We retrain the brain, which helps to stabilize the network activity, because that's what we're doing. An efficient brain is one that is stable. And what we can do is compare your child's brain or the adult brain to a normative database. And then what we call it training your brain to its most stable and efficient. So we would probably for ADHD train down that high theta activity so people can then think clearly and focus. And what we found is there's these incredible non-medication approaches to addressing ADHD, right? Again, food, so diet, lifestyle, neurofeedback. and you don't have to necessarily rely on the stimulant medications, the Adderall, the Vyvanse, that for some kids can have side effects. So that's the beauty of a child with ADHD, right? Things that you can do to help them. And neuroimaging, I think, has really provided an extraordinary opportunity to understand what this does in the brain. Again, it's the prefrontal cortex, which is, we call it your brain CEO. It allows us to do higher level thinking, impulse control, rational decision making, the part of the brain involved in personality and social skills. So now I'll pivot to autism spectrum disorder. And it's so funny, I'm really connected to those that are on the spectrum. I think I have a true appreciation of their brilliance. There tends to be just heightened brilliance in terms of math and science, and the aptitude of these kids is extraordinary. And I truly think it's the unique wiring that they have. You know, from a neurobiological standpoint, we see differences in the cerebellum and cerebellum vermis. So the cerebellum is involved in coordinated movement, coordinated thought. The cerebellum makes connections to the prefrontal cortex. So prefrontal cortex is involved as well. We see elevated activity in the amygdala, which is the part of the brain, sort of the brain's emotional center. But when it's elevated, that's what we think of with fight or flight. You know, your amygdala is activated. So we see increase in the amygdala. We also see with ASD, so we've got cerebellum, amygdala, anterior cingulate cortex is overactive. So the anterior cingulate cortex, we think of it as the brain's gear shifter. It allows us to go smoothly from one thought to another. So for a child with ADHD who has stereotypical movements, repetitive thought patterns, sometimes they can't speak or communicate well, we see that there are connectivity issues with these children. But sort of from a positive perspective, you know, we can nurture these kids and play to the strengths. But from a treatment perspective, and again, I'm going to bring in neurofeedback, you can do a QEEG of the brain, again, a non-invasive way to measure the electrical activity of the brain, takes 20 to 30 minutes. You can do it on a child with autism. It will allow us to target what specific regions are dysfunctional, because autism isn't just one thing. For some children, it's toxicity, and we see a toxic exposure in the brain. Activity in these specific brain regions that I brought up, and we need to quiet that down. And what's interesting about neurofeedback in autistic children is when you quiet those brain regions down, you can actually have parents see their children communicate. And there is nothing more rewarding than to do something like that, of a non-invasive treatment where the child's own brain is literally training itself. Because again, neurofeedback is like biofeedback. So biofeedback in the body, you teach somebody biofeedback, you can use breath work to help calm down somebody's heart rate and blood pressure. And neurofeedback is the way that your own brain retrains itself to connect more effectively.
Love it. I love it. It's a very exciting possibility that as we start to imagine this, you know, another world where we nurture the brains of everybody in biofeedback, not just through technology, but biofeedback through connection to nature, you know, and this idea of, like, you know, getting children with autism spectrum out onto farms and sitting with chickens, or, you know, interacting with a goat is one experience I had with an autistic child that was really profound. You know, I had never kind of tagged goats as being a therapeutic animal until I watched this interaction happen and realized there was some sort of neurofeedback, biofeedback thing going on between this animal and this child, where the animal was seeing and understanding this child on levels that no human probably can, and was giving feedback to the child. And that child improved their social skills in moments, it seemed like, where it suddenly understood that I'm me, that goat is them, we're having this experience. Whereas moments before, I think it was just this cacophony of input in it, and there was no sense of self. And so these animals are able to give humans a sense of self that perhaps we're starting to lose as we start to lose the mirror-like quality of looking at another soul. We start to leave each other very lonely, whether we have autism spectrum or not. We can go to lunch with somebody and still feel lonely at the end of it because we've lost the ability to really connect at the soul level. We connect consciously and intellectually, and we talk about business for an hour, and then we leave and feel no more seen or heard than we did going into that hour of interaction. And so there's this opportunity for us to start to look beyond the human interaction to understand that nature was designed as our ultimate neurofeedback unit. Have you seen any evidence of this?
I love you for bringing this up. You make me so happy. So the beauty of what you just said is so profound, because one thing that I've taught people, and I know you probably already know this, being out in nature, the earth has her own heartbeat, the Schumann resonance, which is at about 7.8 hertz, which is right there in that sort of calming theta brainwave, theta alpha brainwave state. And when we go out in nature and just sit on the earth, bare feet, taking in the vibratory rate of the earth core, we attune, our bodies attune to that. So that's a way to shift your brainwave activity naturally. And so I love how you just brought that up, is a way to do neurofeedback for your brain without having to go into an office and sit in a clinical setting. You could just go outside to the park. So that's number one. Number two, the reason why I even brought up that I showed horses for 10 years in my early career, not just called a career, not just to talk about, yes, I've suffered head injuries and I really relate to the athlete population that I work with, but I feel that my work is going to come full circle back to the animals and working with horses, particularly for children with autism and veterans and firefighters and police officers that have post-traumatic stress disorder. I am fascinated at the human-animal connection. I feel that it is heart-based. When we come from the heart and unconditional love, right, the heart just resonates and impacts our brain function. And as you have seen, a connection with an autistic child and a goat, and there's something about being on top of the animal and feeling the movement of it underneath us. I will share with you, my father rode horses as well. So we've had horses in our family for 40 years. And when I talk to firefighters and talk to them about my father's story, I always found it fascinating that as a Vietnam vet and as a firefighter who has seen more death, probably the equivalent amount of death than somebody who's also worked in a hospital setting. I found it really fascinating that my father was so happy and kind and joyous. There was no post-traumatic stress issue. I was almost intrigued by it. I thought that that's a little bit of an outlier. I mean, I don't know if he compartmentalized it, but my father rode horses with me. You know, he started back when I was 7 and I got horses. We got him one for Christmas. So he rode for 40 years. And it wasn't, so my father passed in 2017. His horse passed away in 2016. And I always thought, wow, you know, I'm his child, but his horse child had passed. And then I felt like he felt it was okay to go. But I do truly feel that my father was able to work through traumatic memories, things that he would never talk about, because I appreciate the male, you know, men aren't always easy to get them to open up and express themselves. And unless you're coming into our clinic and we image your brain and we see the patterns that are consistent with anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, because there are very specific neurobiological patterns there that we can help to calm down. I am amazed that he was able to live almost 8 decades of life really emotionally balanced. And so I do feel like there's going to be a chapter of my career where I am studying, doing neuroimaging with autistic kids and people with post-traumatic stress disorder in animals. I'd love to do pre and post imaging of, maybe studying people who've done this for a year, but I love that you brought this up, and I would encourage any parent who's here listening to get their children out and connect with the animals. That heart connection is extraordinary for the brain.
It's beautiful. I love it. I love the equestrian work. I've been in close contact with a number of colleagues over the years that are involved with equestrian therapy in different parts of the country, and from vets to children, it just it astounds how quickly the neurology and biology responds to the consistent interaction with these animals. And for the horse, I'm struck by the rhythms that are in the movement there, and
Right.
I could see the possibility that as we get better and better at understanding the kinesiology of horses, that we're going to find all kinds of fascinating rhythms that are built into the canter and that gallop and
Yes.
things.
I will share with you, and this is really personal, but it is, and I wrote briefly about it in my book. When I was a young child, I had what's called trichotillomania, which is an anxiety disorder where you pull out your hair. And, as I was saying, young children, when you're 5, 6, 7, you don't know how to regulate your emotions. Nobody teaches you. And this was my unique neurobiological wiring. And my mom, bless her heart, she actually bought these dolls and literally trained me to pull the doll's hair out instead of my own, which is quite comical. So she had this whole thing of dolls that had no hair. But that was also the time that I started riding and showing horses. So I sometimes wonder, even for myself, if, connecting with the horses has helped to really balance my neurochemistry over time. And I share the story because, again, I think sometimes we may underestimate the contribution that animals have in our lives, and how, they open our hearts and allow us to experience and feel love. And when we're feeling love, we can't feel fear and anxiety. It's really interesting, this polarity of emotions. So, if you're thinking that your child is, really sort of not connected or feeling very anxious, I recommend take them to a petting zoo, right? Put them on the back of a horse, have them connect with an animal. I do feel this is an underutilized therapeutic tool that we have available to us.
It's amazing. Fantastic. Dr.
Yay.
Willeumier, you are lighting us up. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be turning to you, Peter, to continue this. Many of you in the audience have gotten to know Peter very well over these many years, or these many months together. Peter Cummings, doctor of Western medicine, allopathic medicine, MD with 3 subspecialties in neuro sciences, and one of your areas of expertise and interests have long been youth and head trauma, and how to reduce injury and recover from head traumas, Peter. And you run a nonprofit there in Pennsylvania, and now going national with some of that programming for children in impact sports, and recognizing that there's ways in which to support and prevent injury, but also that there's huge advantages to impact sports for neurobiology. And so why don't you give us a little bit of that kind of long and winding road from neuropathologists and looking at pathologic brains to looking at the potential that these dynamic interactions, whether horseback riding or football, that's somehow the impact that we get in exercise can actually be a benefit to neural function on levels. So take us through that journey, and excited to also just tie it in over time with your own personal journey of specialization as you've experienced in your life. But start us off with kind of that journey from neuropathologist to neurobiologist, I would say.
Yeah, well, can we just keep listening to Kristen? I don't want to just, I want to keep listening. I think I try to learn one new thing a day, and I just learned 30, so I'm all set for the rest of the month, I think. I've known Kristen for a number of years now, and it's always a pleasure to hear her speak. And it's only been a few months for us, Zach, but it sure feels like a few years, doesn't it? We're doing a lot of work, and it's very exciting to be back here. I always look forward to this, and for the people who've been to many of these, Zach and I will start talking about the next one as soon as we finish this. This is something he and I are very passionate about and have a lot of fun putting together. So it's always great. One thing you said at the opening, Zach, I wanted to touch on. You were talking that those really profound opening comments that reminded me of something my grandmother said a few months ago. She's going to be 102 in a few months, and she lives alone. She's a rock star, right? But she says that this is the worst time that she's ever lived through. And you're talking about world wars, the Depression, and in terms of how we treat each other. She was telling me stories about the Depression where, you know, she had a friend who was eating an apple and another friend asked, "Can I have the core when you're done?" You know, that kind of desperation. And the friend said, "Why don't we just share my apple?" You know, those sort of things aren't happening in our communities anymore. And it's very, very sad. But back to the point of the brain, and one of the things that I keep hearing here, a theme for me anyway, and it's interesting to come back and start talking about my story a little bit, is the word resiliency. Just keeps resonating when I'm listening to your discussion. And that was one of the things that really set me off on my journey for looking at the brain. And I wanted to do sports medicine when I was in high school and college, and sort of my boat sailed into the worlds of forensic pathology and neuropathology. And particularly with the brain, I remember it very vividly. My first neuroanatomy class in medical school, where they brought the brain out and they started to cut the brain and look at and I was just blown away by it. And I just couldn't get enough of it. And it became very obvious to me very early on in that situation that I had a career crisis in front of me. I needed to do something in my life involving the brain. Every single thing I did was a neuro elective. Every neuro patient I could find, I went and took histories and did examinations of. I couldn't learn enough about it. And it was really fascinating to me and I joke that it's great to be a neuroscientist because the most common answer you give is, I don't know. Right? The brain is a remarkable, mysterious thing that even centuries into this thing called human existence, we don't know a lot about it. We have a lot of hypotheses, but we don't know. One of the things, seeing these patients, and there was one patient in particular I became very, very close with. I did a project on him. Was a gentleman who had a stroke, and part of his issue with his stroke is he couldn't remember. He had it's called expressive aphasia. There were certain things he couldn't say. He couldn't remember the words for things, and he would give me, you know, when you forget a word, it's at the tip of your tongue. But he could remember it in Irish, which was a second language that he spoke. So he would go through the conversation, forget the word for a water bottle in English, but know it in Irish. And it became really amazing to me that you can compartmentalize things like that, but still have them so interconnected in that resiliency of still being able to say, there's my water bottle, and be able to go to the pub and sing songs in Irish without having any problems, was really fascinating to me. And that led to seeing head injury survivors who were going through therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, things to help them with more motor skills, but the cognitive changes that could happen as well, and the improvement that you could gain function. And this idea that I came into medical school with, that, you know, the brain is this glass ball inside your head and you have to be very careful with it because it's very fragile and it's the only brain we have. And you know, it's this mysterious, mythical thing, don't mess with it, is not true. We're not that fragile. It's actually, you know, as Kristen said, you know, it's a few days ago, it's pretty hard to kill somebody. And the brain is an amazing adaptive machine. And it's not something you lose after childhood. It's something you can continue to develop plasticity as you move on in life. For me, and you guys talked about ADHD, I still have it, ADHD. And back in the 70s when I was in school, that wasn't a word. You know, I was just, you know, a lazy buffoon who couldn't clean his locker, kept losing his homework, couldn't keep track of things. And I had to have a teacher be my prefrontal lobe to help me plan tasks and these sort of things. But now it's my superpower. I wouldn't be able to do half the things I do without my ADHD, and I embrace it and I love it. And you know, I think that this idea of making the ways that people's brains think differently and function differently, and making that a disease and a pathology, really sells the human existence, the human experience short. And when I met Kristen, so I went into neuropathology and I was interested in some other sort of aspects of it. And then my son wanted to play football. And I was terrified by that because I'd seen the news and knew, what was going on in the media. I didn't know a lot about the actual science of it. I just knew what I'd seen in the media. And I loved football growing up as a big part of my life. And I think that youth football was a huge part of my success and giving me a place to I think, and no one's ever done a study on this, and I don't want to, stigmatize the sport, but as a football coach, I've been coaching football for a number of years. I see more children with learning challenges in football than I do in other sports. And for myself and other kids, like my son, who has some ADHD as well, it really speaks to them. The physical nature of it, the constant motion, the constant thinking, the constant strategy. For my son, it's chess. He enjoys the physical nature of it, running around and playing football, but for him, it's the mental challenge of playing the sport. Outthinking somebody for him is a big part of that. So when he wanted to play football, I just didn't want him exposed to it, and we shut it off the TV, and I didn't make a big deal of it. But then he comes home from a friend's house and he'd been playing Madden or something. He busts in the door and he says, "Hey, Dad, have you ever heard of this thing called football?" And I was like, "Oh no, what am I going to do? Right? What am I going to do?" So long story short, doing my due diligence as a parent, I felt very comfortable with him playing football. I thought it was a very safe environment where we were for him to play. And that process led me to Kristen, who we worked with on a book called Brainwashed, The Bad Science Behind CTE and the Plot to Destroy Football, which is a very ominous sounding title, which book titles are supposed to be, get your eyes on them, but unfortunately people don't read the book, they just read the title. And the whole second half of that book was talking to people like Kristen, Alex Guerrero at TB12, who we've talked to here before, people who are really positive energy merchants, people who are constantly driving positive energy into the world, who are making huge impacts on recovery and plasticity and regeneration, rejuvenation of the brain. And what Kristen is doing is just so incredible. And we wanted to empower people and let people know that you can help yourself. You can get treatment for your symptoms. You can get better. This is not a death sentence. There are ways to go about getting better. And what Kristen has done in that regard has probably saved countless lives. And I'm not exaggerating on that because of the fear associated with this and really helping a lot of people. So I found her very, very inspiring and comforting in that way, to know that there are people like her and Mickey Collins at UPMC, people who are really out there doing tremendous work with plasticity of the brains. And again, it's a very rare outcome in terms of youth football players. But when we confuse it sometimes, because I think the incidence of neurodegenerative diseases across the board are skyrocketing. And is it a phenomenon associated with contact sports, or is it also something going on in our community where we're having elevated levels of this anyway? And is it a perfect storm of people who may have some susceptibility due to lifestyle issues and exposure to head injury, and the perfect storm of these toxins in our environment that are elevating and accelerating our disease states? Is that what's going on here? And I think that's a really very, very important question to answer.
I think let me touch on that for a moment, because I think it's such an important piece of the puzzle that we do this all the time in medicine, is we find a correlation and then we assume causation. And so this has certainly happened this year with this pandemic. We saw a virus and we saw people dying of a respiratory neurologic condition that we came to call COVID-19, which is not a description of a virus, it's a description of a neurovascular immune system event. So there was a virus and then there was an event, and we try to make those things, marry those together and say, this is causing this. And we did the same thing with HIV and AIDS. So we said, here's a new virus we found. It seems to be present in AIDS patients. It must be causing AIDS. And yet every time we've infected other animals, monkeys, everything else with HIV, we find no cause of AIDS. It doesn't cause AIDS. No matter how high of a titer we create of HIV in the bloodstream of a mouse or a rat or a monkey, there's no AIDS. And so despite that, repeated decades and decades of failure to prove any causation, we can't get out of this causation correlation kind of problem. And I think you just nailed one, which is this, why suddenly in the late 1990s did we see Alzheimer's and autism going like this? And then by 2010, we have this big story about athletes are getting concussion syndromes that are leading to this degenerative state and all of that. We need to take a step back and say, is this correlations or causations? And in my laboratory, as we've worked more around glyphosate, which is the most prominent form of Agent Orange that you mentioned earlier, Dr. Willeumier, we've got this opportunity to really think about, wow, we've got this chemical now that exposed your father to risks of Parkinson's back in Vietnam. We're now putting that into the Cheerios of children. If you've got kids that are eating these organophosphate chemicals that disrupt chemical pathways, is that really the causation? And all of these activities being football or whatever isn't the thing. And if you take a step back, Peter, you know this history better than I do, so fill in the gaps here. But it seems to me, being a non-football player, that even when I remember back to my childhood, kids were given crap equipment to run around and bang heads. And there was no talk in the 1970s about concussion injuries and blah, blah, blah. Like, we were running around doing this. Suddenly, with decades of better protective equipment and everything else, every kid seems to be, prone to some sort of post-concussive syndrome. And I'm seeing this in all sports. I'm seeing this in gymnasts who, hit their head, and now they have months of chronic fatigue and all this vulnerability that we weren't seeing in the 1970s and 80s in the same way. And so it begs the question is, did we do something fundamentally to the food system, to the environment around these children that's made them more and more prone to neuro injury in these concussive potential sports? And the data that we now have is pretty profound in our lab, that actin, which is one of the primary protein structures within neural environments, both extracellular and intracellular environments, actin is responsible for moving resources up and down a neuron. And Dr. Willeumier, you should dive in there and tell us something more of the beauty there, because I know you've spent 10 years looking under microscopes at these neurons, and they blow me away in their beauty and their complexity and all that. But I'm struck by the fact that glyphosate disrupts actin structure. And so if you suddenly realize that we're eating a chemical every day, 75% of our rainfall, 80% of our air we breathe, contaminated with this chemical that destroys this protein structure that's responsible for the protection and the adaptation to injury, this is perhaps the real smoking gun, is that it's not contact sports that's leading to an explosion of degenerative disease. It's actually undermining of protein structure within the human brain and peripheral brain, or peripheral nervous system, that's leading to these events. So go ahead and answer that, Pete.
I think I always love the discussion about association is not causation. And the example I was like, right now up here in Maine, this past week has been brutal hot. And I know that lines outside the ice cream shops are up, down the street. So we're selling a lot of ice cream, and there've been some drownings in lakes. So it's like saying when increased sales of ice cream is leading to drownings, right? They're not associated. There's no association causation. They may be correlated because it's hot weather. Hot weather makes people go to the lakes. Hot weather makes people get ice cream, right? Correlated, but association does not mean causation for what that means to us scientifically. So when you take something like brain injury, there are so many factors that play a role in how you respond to it. Nutritional, number one. If kids are drinking a lot of, the worst thing you can give to a kid with a head injury on a sideline is a Gatorade, right? Because this is an energy disruption where you're having a problem with the metabolism of glucose and lactate in the brain. And last thing you want to do is give this kid glucose, which is sugar in your 37 to 42 grams of sugar in a Gatorade. Nutritional, hydration, fatigue, environmental factors like you're talking about, pollutants and toxins, genetic factors. There may be genetic factors we haven't even identified yet that may lead to less successful outcomes of rehabilitation of brain injury. So it's probably multifactorial. And what I think it comes down to, the lifestyles that we live now, this fast-paced, fast food, toxin-filled environment that we live in. And I mean that from the crap we read on Twitter and TikTok to the news that freaks us out every day. All of these things have detrimental effects on our resiliency. And I think we not necessarily become more susceptible, but we become less resilient. And maybe it's because our bodies, the front lines are stretched too thin. You know, we're fighting biological warfare against, you know, ourselves in so many different ways with the things we're doing to our bodies, to our minds, to our hearts, to our souls, that it's very hard to maintain resilience when you have insults that you need to deal with. And you know, that sort of thought process became really interesting to me when we had the last webinar, and when we started talking about doing a brain talk. I thought, well, this is where we really need to go with this, because it's scary times, and how we think about the world that we're in. Is we really interpret our world with our reticular activating system, which is this little part of your brain stem that is a reticular. It means network. So it's this kind of web of interconnected parts of your brain that makes you aware of threats. It's why you wake up in the middle of the night when a baby cries. It's when somebody drops something loud and you turn and look at it. That's a reticular activating system. And it's our threat detector. It's our threat radar. And we spend our whole day just looking for threats. And that's, you know, good. It keeps us alive, keeps you from getting hit by a car when you cross the street. But everything that really enters into our awareness has to go through that filter of the reticular activating system. So we're really fear prone to interpretation of our world. And it's that sort of fight or flight response that we have to the world around us that really gives us all this stress. And when everything, you know, the mainstream media is doing a tremendous job of terrifying everybody in the planet right now, and dividing people and making us scared to, you know, the thing we've talked about before is, I think one of the most dangerous things out there is the continued death count from people from COVID. It's daily, and you know, let's be real. I mean, that virus is never going away. There's never going to be a day in our lives where there is 0 cases. And this constant 12 cases today, 14 cases today, just wearing people down. And we've got to find a way to turn off that reticular activating system and get back to where we are with this centered sort of approach to the world around us, and start interpreting it with the beauty that's around us rather than the fear that we're constantly aware of.
I love that. And I think, you know, I want to turn to you for a minute with your reactions to that, Dr. Willeumier, but I think that one of the things that's striking me in this is that, you know, we have this important differentiation, because one of the comments that came through on my social media yesterday when I posted on this event and we were going to do this, and the difference between the RAS and the system and the kind of parasympathetic rest and relax and creativity brain. Somebody came back across social media and said, "Oh, great advice, Zach. You want everybody to not use their RAS system, which has kept us alive for hundreds of thousands of years, and you want us to go into some sort of, you know, quiet, non-stressed, non-fearful state of laziness." And it's a very good point, because, you know, like you said, you got to jump out of the way of the car, or you got to, you know, be prepared for the battle that ensues when the neighboring tribe attacks and suddenly. So the RAS can be life-saving, but I want to really differentiate here the difference between acute and chronic stimulus. And a good example of this is acute inflammation and chronic inflammation. Acute inflammation is really life-saving. It's the thing that you cut yourself or you break a leg. It's the process that allows for the regenerative event to occur. You end up with a stronger bone at the end of a acute inflammatory event instead of weaker bone. So it's this adaptive, pro-life, pro-biology thing. You switch to chronic inflammation, where you're now running out of the reservoir of coping mechanisms to respond to injury, and you start to deplete those response systems. Now you turn into a situation where the immune system is its own problem, and it starts stimulating an inflammatory reaction that it can't respond to. And in that, another injury occurs and it responds again. And now you have this chronic destructive force that is the immune system that was supposed to be the acute inflammatory, you know, savior. The same thing is happening at the brain. If the RAS is life-saving in the event of that acute fearful event, the lion jumps out of the jungle, you have to respond and do whatever. But if you are every day responding to the news and the media and everything else that goes into your brain through that RAS response system, where you're in that sympathetic fight or flight state, now you are doing the equivalent of chronic inflammation on the brain, and you start to deplete that regenerative resilience factor that you're talking about. So just for the audience, I want you guys to understand that RAS is not bad until it becomes your way of life. When RAS is your way of life, that's when it becomes destructive. And this is how we help children with autism spectrum disorder or ADHD move to positive environments where you take them out of the stimulus that's creating this chronic RAS state. You put them into a state of flow, whatever neuronormal is for them. If they're nonverbal, can't communicate, they can still be in a flow state, and you can see their energy shift very quickly when you take away the stimuli that's got them in RAS. So for each of you listening right now, I want you to think about what is driving you to be in a sympathetic fight or flight state all of the time. I want you to have a RAS system. I'm happy for you to jump out of the way of the speeding car, but I do not want you to be in that state for one reason, and one main reason, day in and day out, which is you're going to lose your creative capacity as soon as you move into that RAS response. And so, Kristen, why don't you take us through that a little bit? Like, how does the fight or flight sympathetic state shut down our creative brain?
I'm so happy we jumped into this. What's so beautiful about this webinar is like there's so many amazing things that are coming up from what Dr. Pete was talking about, and now we're talking about stress. I think what's really important for people to understand, and we know this now more than ever during COVID, where the stress response is elevated for all of us daily, especially having watched the news. I'm someone that studies the brain, and watching the news, watching the death count go up, that scares me. And I know when we have elevated chronic stress, it causes the release of cortisol, epinephrine, adrenaline, right? That's great in the short term, but the body cannot function optimally. It cannot restore itself when it is in this state of elevated cortisol and epinephrine, norepinephrine. And what that ends up doing is not only will it shrink brain volume, but it's been shown to shrink the hippocampus. So that's the area of the brain essential for learning and memory. So when we sleep, it's our hippocampus that helps and consolidate it and store it into long-term memory. So stress shrinks the hippocampus. And the reason why is because we have some of the highest numbers of glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus. And we also have the glucocorticoid receptors in the frontal lobes, or the prefrontal cortex, which again, we call the brain CEO. It's, the organ of higher level thinking, rational decision making, impulse control, focus, creativity. So if stress is impacting our hippocampus and our frontal lobe function, it's going to be hard to make great decisions. And this is to Zach's point, when you're in a stress state, you are not going to be in your most creative flow state. Your creative flow state happens when your brain is in the alpha brainwave pattern, which is what we go into when we're meditating. It's a quieter brainwave state. So I'm kind of jumping around here, but so stress does not allow us to be our most creative. It does not allow our bodies to go into the restorative component. So stress, chronic stress, will accelerate brain aging. The reason why this is so important, again, coming from my field, when I started to learn that by the age of 40, our brain volume shrinks about 5% each decade, and then that accelerates after the age of 80. So we get this brain shrinkage. Now, before you get nervous, and also we lose 86,000 neurons per day. In the context of 86 billion neurons, it's actually not a lot. But again, we have to be aware these are just the normal aging mechanisms that happen. And we have to be proactive at protecting our brains. If we are in a chronically stressed state, we're just accelerating that brain aging. If we learn to tap into the parasympathetic state, which we could do through diaphragmatic breathing, which we can do through exercise to reduce our cortisol and epinephrine levels, which we could do through meditation. Meditation can actually help quiet the mind and quiet the thought patterns that get repeated when we're afraid. And to that point, when we're afraid and that little monkey mind keeps going, right, and we spin on the fears of the coronavirus, when we keep that in our consciousness, we call that a fractal of thought, and we energize and expand that. So one of the beauties of meditation or a yoga practice or a deep breath work practice, it helps to shift you into that parasympathetic state. In fact, breath work is one of the easiest ways to do it, because when we're doing the deep diaphragmatic breathing, that puts us into the parasympathetic state. And I'm sure Zach has talked about this. It's extraordinary when we're working with people who have PTSD and stress disorders. It's the first take-home tool that you have is learning the breath work. I know some people have a hard time doing that, which is why we have cool technologies available like alpha stimulators. There's little boxes that you can buy and hold on to that can put your body into the alpha state. So, because I know when some people are stressed, you tell them to stop thinking the thoughts, but they can't because the way their brain is wired, they don't know how to shut it off. Or you try to teach somebody to meditate, but if their mind is going, they may not be able to sit in the stillness. One thing that I love to teach people about getting into that parasympathetic state and learning how to be quieter, like when we're in our sleep state, because when we sleep, that is the number one way to restore our brain and body. We get the most restorative benefits from our sleep. But during our waking day, if we want to is to use what are they? The flotation tanks. So Zach, I don't know if you've ever talked about this, but I've actually gone into one. So it's a sensory deprivation tank. The water is the same as body temperature. It's a salt water. And you, especially for people who love water, who love swimming, I mean, there are certain people that just gravitate to water. To teach your body how to be still, especially if you can't sit still in meditation and the breath work isn't working, try the flotation tank. It's extraordinary. It will calm your muscles. It will lower your heart rate, lower your blood pressure. You will learn what stillness feels like in a waking state. We know what stillness feels like when we sleep, but we're also unconscious, so we're not really aware of it. But I think, you know, in talking about how to be more resilient and tap more into our parasympathetic nervous system, we all know how to tap into our sympathetic. That's easy. We just turn on the television. Whether we watch a football game and get excited, or an NBA playoff game, or, you know, we go to the news and we get the bejesus scared out of us about the coronavirus. Tuning into that parasympathetic state. Again, you could even go out in nature, like Zach was talking about, and just sit and lay in the grass and connect with the earth frequency to put you in that state. You could listen to CDs. So there are CDs by Hemisync and certain CDs and binaural beats that will help to shift your brain into the alpha state or theta state, which are the calmer, more relaxed brain waves, which will help get you into the parasympathetic state. When we do this, our body can rest, it can regenerate, our cortisol levels go down, our heart rate goes down, we're happier. So I could riff on this topic forever, but
I feel like, yeah, it was happening to me while you were talking. I was like,
oh, good.
I was dropping.
Exactly. I was like,
Stress was relieving.
Yeah.
I was about to fall asleep there. So
Okay.
I like that. What a powerful tool. And I'm struck by your comments earlier around, you know, ADHD and autism around theta waves, but also around the frontal lobe, quietness that happens in ADHD, where you don't have this executive function, decision-making, risk reward calculation going on all the time. Instead, you're just curious and you're just driving. So the ADHD brain is a fearless brain, which I really love. And so this is why so many of our entrepreneurs have ADHD, because they can do that risk, that they have a high tolerance for risk that others don't, who have that high frontal lobe, risk scenario going all the time, that calculator. Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
This is so fun. So people who have ADHD brains are like my father, combat helicopter pilot, rides motorcycles, rides horses, runs into burning buildings to save people's lives. He thrived off of adventure, because you get that dopamine boost, which makes you feel alive. So, we really give the diagnosis of ADHD to people who can't harness the power in a way that it positively affects their life. Typically, they aren't able to wake up and get to school on time or get to work on time, or they're really having trouble learning and focusing. And that's when we use the extra tools we have, the neurofeedback, the dietary changes, to help give those kids and adults more access to their prefrontal cortex. But I'm with you in terms of diagnoses. I mean, my godfather has bipolar disorder, and I see that as an asset. When his brain is on fire, he is an extraordinary businessman and has made an extraordinary amount of money, and he's been able to harness its power for good. But when he becomes a little too manic, right? He bought 2 buildings and a Maserati in one day. When he became manic, he tried to convert me to another religion. So we see some of the, and we kind of laugh and jest, but, sometimes we have these neurobiological patterns and we give them names as disorders. But like you, Zach, I like to celebrate what's positive about your unique neurobiological wiring, and then to give you tools for when your brain isn't able to function in a way that you need it to, right? If you're bipolar and you're manic, you might be having a lot of fun, because manic bipolar people actually love that phase, but you might drive everybody else in your life crazy. And the depression part is not fun, because that can last for months. So, we can use the tools we have to help stabilize the connectivity in the brain. And I think if I were to leave the viewers, and I know we're not ending yet, but something that I want to share is, no matter what issue you might have, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism spectrum disorder, a form of ADHD, generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, there are tools we have to help your brain become more stabilized. And it's the beautiful synchrony of the way the neurons fire that helps us. This is why we always talk about getting your brain to be its most stable and efficient. If we are anxious or stressed, we might be using too much of our cognitive resources focused on the anxiety and the stress, and then we can't think clearly, which is why, getting back to the focus of this webinar, it's about putting people in the parasympathetic state, trying to calm those networks down, because when they're calm, that's when you're able to access the genius information. And this is why, people talk about going into meditative states, especially CEOs know about it, and accessing the creative genius. And really, I think it's about getting quiet and going within, because we all can tap into our inner wisdom instead of going and looking for it outside. We all have it on the inside. And I feel like, again, meditation is such an amazing technique that people can use to help quiet the mind. Okay, I'll stop now.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I love this. And I think one of the things that's coming up in the Q&A here throughout it is, what is the effect of spirituality on neurofunction and all of this? And it strikes me that, when we're doing studies on shamans and yogis, my clinic accidentally set up right next to Yogaville in Virginia. I had no idea the place even existed. Set up my clinic. Turned out I was like the de facto doctor for a couple hundred yogis that had been living there for decades. And so I got to do a bunch of energetic imaging, where I was looking at the human energy field around these yogis. And one of the things that strikes me is they are trying to often, in their meditation or spiritual pursuit, get themselves into a theta wave state, which is exactly where autistic kids are at baseline. They have such a theta state that they can't have executive function. And so there's this beautiful possibility that is autism. Really, the silver lining of autism is that the human brain is now moving into a whole generation of children that are exceptional theta wave generators, and that as a population, we may be in this state of collective consciousness starting to move towards the hyper-spirituality state of humanity, where we could actually be manifesting a different spiritual consciousness through this broad theta wave experience of the autistic children that are among us. And nobody's been around autistic children that doesn't recognize there are angels among us. Like these souls that choose an autistic journey talk about a courageous journey. I mean, just overwhelming, courageous spirit within these children, but they are so generous in spirit. When they start to heal and they start to talk, like, they make me cry all of the time because they are so generous in spirit. They are so loving in ways that I don't even know how to be loving. They're just, I think generosity is the overwhelming experience, which of course is what you would expect from a theta experience. So what are you experiencing or have experienced in that neuroimaging world around people in meditation? Or sex is another good example of where we get these big, shifts in neurofunction around oxytocin and prolactin, around orgasm and things like this. Childbirth, another moment where you get these huge explosive changes in the theta waves and all of that. So what have you seen in some of those really dynamic environments of the brain chemistry around spiritual experience?
I love that we're actually going into this level of exploration. I want to share with you, and this is just a thought, a hypothesis, seeing that we've got more kids that are here on the planet today that have autism. Don't you find it curious that they're here at the same time we're having this explosion in technology? And I have had the great honor of working with people who are on the spectrum and have seen the brilliance, the technological brilliance of these minds. They may not be as comfortable sometimes in social situations until you make them comfortable, because anxiety, there's sort of this heightened sense of anxiety, but the unique wiring that they have may be primed for the explosion in technology that we're experiencing in big data. And it's so, on some sort of grander spiritual level, they might be perfect for where we're at in this point in time. And I am, excited to actually follow the trajectory of that path and see where they go. When it comes to spirituality, I will share this with you. I live in Los Angeles, and right down the road from me is a place called the Self-Realization Fellowship. It's in Pacific Palisades. Paramahansa Yogananda came over and built this. It's literally a meditation center. People from all over the globe come. Gandhi's ashes, a portion of them are on the premises. It's this just beautiful spiritual center. And I stumbled upon it, back in the 90s when I moved to LA and learned about meditation. They teach Kirtan Kriya, yoga and meditation techniques. And, being a young, skeptical scientist, very much in my left brain, I was intrigued. I used to just go and study there. I'd bring my books, my big old neuroscience textbooks, and study. Then I befriended some of the monks that were there, and they convinced me to do the meditation training. And I will share with you, I started to be able to learn information really quickly. Here I was in graduate school, like Pete in medical school, what we've got, 5 or 6 classes, we've got to be in the lab. And I was shocked at how much information I could absorb by just being in this environment. And it really intrigued me, truth be told. Before I understood what meditation does to the brain and accessing these brainwave states, whether they're theta or advanced meditators can go into gamma, which are the really high, they're above 40 hertz and higher, these higher frequencies, which can tap into higher levels of perception and cognitive perception. I just was and we've learned, I will tell you again, before knowing anything about what meditation does to the brain. I mean, we now know it grows brain volume in the hippocampus. It can improve brain volume in the cerebellum, again, which is involved in motor coordination and connects to the frontal lobe, so it helps with frontal lobe function. It can help us to manage our emotions, bringing down cortisol levels. So before I knew all of this great stuff, I was meditating and having this experience of being able to retain a lot of information. And I thought, this is an untapped superpower. And I feel sometimes people need to be trained in it or need to be around people who do it to really tap into that space, which I would encourage people to do. And to your question of spirituality in the brain, you know, and how it impacts us, I feel that those people, we are spirit beings, right? We're spirit beings in this human body. And I feel that the spirit helps to guide the brain. One of our superpowers is the ability to focus and put our attention on anything that we want. It's why when we were talking about the stressed brain, sometimes I ask people, what are you focused on? Are you focused on the news? Are you focused on what you're going to learn today? Are you focused on your work? So I feel like the spirit can come through the body, guide the attention and the focus, and help you to live your best life possible, right? Your most extraordinary, joyful, loving, connected life. And what an honor to even bring this up on a brain health talk. I wasn't expecting it.
Well, it's my opportunity to throw curveballs, but
yeah, I know.
I want to bring this right over to you, Peter. That you have been through an extraordinary neurologic event, which was a drowning that you occurred, and you shared such a beautiful story of your near-death event at our Death and Dying seminar that we did a few months back. And so for those of you listening who did not catch Death, Dying, and Rebirth, you've got to go listen to that 5-doctor panel because it's a mind-blowing journey just to hear about all of the after-death and near-death experiences that people have witnessed and experienced. But Pete, in your journey, you really experienced a very freeing state in that drowning where you were released completely from the RAS. You went into a flow state that took you into this extraneural experience where you were able to have visual and auditory experiences of things going on that were extremely distant to you. Sister in a distant state, all of these things were happening while you were underwater. You had this incredible insight. So take us through a little bit of that ideas around what happens when the brain starts to let go of its rutted journey through the RAS and through its pattern recognition, start to let go of that to be freed up and start to move into this extraneural environment of vibration rather than thought process.
Yeah. And, Kristen made such an important point about the stress and the shrinking of the hippocampus and kind of some hyperactivity of the limbic system and the amygdala. So, that's where your rage comes from. And it's that frontal lobe that, if somebody cuts you off in traffic and you're like, I'm going to run them down and I'm going to tell them. And, your frontal lobe says, wait a minute, just calm down, just let it go. Everybody gets a pass, just get home safe. When you stress, alters that response. And that's why people who are stressed out, they're angry, they're short. You can tell when someone's bothered, got stressed because they're cranky. And the thing that actually that helps restore the volume of the hippocampus and repair some of those connections and maintain them is sleep. Healthy, deep sleep, which we've touched on. So I just wanted to hit that point because Kristen, it was so important. For me, and just sort of to back up a little bit into that story, I know hopefully the couple thousand people that are here heard that webinar before because it was so great. Going into that experience, I was a scientist, right? I had no interest in spiritual world. I was an atheist. I didn't have, all of these near-death things that people had described that I admittedly at that time didn't know a lot about. Was an artifact of a dying brain going through a lack of oxygen. It was a hallucination, and actually a very kind hallucination of your brain allowing you to end your existence permanently without the terror of knowing. So one of the interesting things for me coming back on that was doing, a forensic investigation of my own death, is what I say. And there were things I had to explain that I could not explain with my knowledge of the brain. And say that with the idea that I have cut and dissected and examined thousands and thousands and thousands of brains. And there was nothing that I experienced that I could explain with any science that I had in my knowledge base. So when I started to kind of look into it a little more, I started to realize that the overwhelming majority of neurosurgeons, neuroscientists, people who with really high-end neuro careers, as they come, and I put myself in this boat now with my age, come to that other side of your career. I mean, I don't want to say it's the downslide, but it's the other side. You know, when you're the wise person, now you're on the over the hump of training, and now you're an expert and comfortable in saying I don't know, and you're in the smooth part of your career. At that point, so many neuroscientists say it's a two-system thing here. The mind and the brain are two completely different things. Consciousness exists outside of the human brain, and that it is persistent after our death, and it's interconnected amongst us all. Not just me use that, Kristen, and 3,000 people listening, but with every living creature, plant on this planet is connected in some way, shape, or form through this collective consciousness that we have. That's the overwhelming opinion of neuroscientists as they progress through their career. And I think that's really important. These are, we're in an age now where, the government's saying, well, maybe these are aliens flying UFOs. Well, maybe there is, consciousness after death that persists. And I experienced it, and I can say scientifically and philosophically that I have no question on that. The thing that I found for me in that was this incredible liberation of the idea of who I was. I went into that river a very different person than who came out. And I do say I died, because I did. And the person did not come out of that river. I was driven by a career. I was a hyper-competitive person, not necessarily with colleagues, but with myself. And I was constantly trying to accomplish, constantly trying to publish, I've written 5 books. I've, all these things that I just had to do as part of this push to become a CV, to become a piece of paper. And I came out of it losing that attachment to those things. And the way I kind of viewed it, I think we talked about it a little bit in the death seminar, was, when we sit here today and our importance is out in the past and in the future, and we're future driven, and we're constantly obsessed with getting to some point, getting somewhere, doing something, or completely obsessed with some mistake we made, something we did in the past, some great event that I wish I could have stayed in that moment forever. And we're never here. We're never in this moment that we're actually in. The past and the present are completely, the past and the future don't exist. They're products of where you are right now and where you project yourself. That experience for me allowed me to let go of that attachment. So, the importance that I had in the past and the future, and the value being right now, it allowed me to match those, where the importance and the value is here. It allowed me to free those concepts that I had of who I had to be, where I had to go with life, and made me more focused on where I am. And really being engaged with people like you and the people who I've met through this work with you is really what it's all about. And that's the great lesson of death. The terror of death is that Dr. Cummings, the author, world-renowned forensic pathologist, is going to be gone forever. That's a terrifying thought, right? But if I let go of that, I was not a big deal. It's just, those things don't matter. And I am going to be continued. I'm going to be part of all these things. All the people that I've lost in my life, both my parents are deceased, they're still here. I still get interactions with them. And it was that beauty. It was so liberating it so altered my life that when I looked at my career and started thinking that, I've done, thousands of autopsies, and I get into medicine because it's corny, but I think when you start off, I think you really genuinely want to help people. This is a competitive career. It's really overachieving people that self-select to go into medical school. It's a very different type of person. But we do it because I really think we want to help. And the way that traditional medicine has developed is that we can't help people anymore. We're hurting people. And I felt like after this experience, I was standing outside of a burning building, just watching it go up in flames and not being able to do anything about it. And it occurred to me And we joked about this a couple of weeks ago, Zach, that when you think back to a more tribal community where you had the witch doctor, and that was the spiritual guide of the community and the healer. And when you separated that out into Western medicine and just became the healer, and you lost that spirituality of it, we really lost our ability to heal. Because you can't heal an injury physiologically or biologically without healing somebody spiritually, without mentally dealing with anxiety and stress and things that come with injuries and diseases. The healing of a soul as somebody has a terminal illness, or for somebody who's losing a loved one. And we've lost that in medicine, and we're left with three things: surgery, pharmaceuticals, and reassurance. You know, they're there now. That's not good enough, and that's not how we should be treating people as physicians. And that's sort of where my journey took me after that.
Amazing. I love it. And I think it's a synopsis of, you know, the conversation of just the freedom that comes when we start to imagine life outside of the brain, right? We are so programmed to believe that our sensory experience is the reality we live in. And the longer I live around science and death and dying, especially in the hospice environment, but also just looking, you know, through the lens of our energy camera, looking at energy fields of humans, I can tell you that the world that you are actually living in is not the one you see and feel around you. The brain is set up very specifically as a sensory organ, right? You've got your visual cortex, you have your, you know, sensory auditory cortex, you've got your olfactory bulb, which is one of the weirdest neural structures in the whole situation. So you have all these subspecialized things that are there to sense the world around you, but they are so limited in their ability to explain what's really happening around you, which is energetic, not biologic. Obviously, the biology is solid. It's a particle state, which is 0.001% of the reality. 99.999% is vacuum space that is full of electromagnetic field program. There is a reality within the electromagnetic field, within the vacuum space within your body, that expresses itself through that 0.01% of biology. But using all these tools that we use in medicine, I'm always struck by what a stupid approach this is you take a fulcrum and you push it up against the 0.01% and try to push the 99.99% because I'm slightly affecting the 0.01% with this antidepressant or anti-anxiety drug, and therefore I'm moving you towards health. No, there's absolutely no way I can change the 99.999% if all my tools are slightly modifying the particle state. And so this is where mindfulness and breath work and sleep become so critical in the potential that we have to be human, because that's where we do the real work of connecting to the electromagnetic field, connecting to this hyper knowledge state. There's consciousness, which is not I think there's a misperception about consciousness that somehow it's like the library of everything. Like that's where all that consciousness is simply it's the understanding of the knowledge field, but it's not the knowledge field. The knowledge field, the whole matrix of the universe is held within the electromagnetic field in the form of vibration. So vibrational energy is the program by which everything unfolds, planets, solar systems, galaxies, and the rest. But here we are in this physical body in a particle moment as an expression of a energetic vibration, which we can call soul, if you feel that. If you're listening to this whole conversation in the audience and you're thinking, what the hell are these guys even talking about spirituality? Like, what do they even mean by spirituality? I want to back it up to this vibration state, that the spirituality we're talking about is a focus of vibrational energy that's expressing itself in your particle state of your body right now. And when your body fails, the energy field that it was expressing a moment ago hasn't disappeared. In fact, that's the law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is you cannot destroy energy. Energy is constant and it is always persistent. It is, in fact, infinite in its nature. And so the fabric of the universe is infinite. And so when you ask what is God or what is spirituality, it's literally the infinite nature of energy. And energy is not random. It is actually structured. It is structured information that is very good at organizing the biology around it. It's very good at taking a star and explaining how to do gravity, and so that there would be planets swirling around it, and all these fabric level things are really energy centers. And so what Peter experienced as he died was a letting go of that physical particle state for a moment, but the brain, in its ability to express, or connect to that knowledge field through what we would call human consciousness, had not died. And so his brain was still functioning, letting go of the biologic particle state, still access to the knowledge field. Now he suddenly had this expansive extrasensory experience of being at one with his child, his wife, knowing that his family was going to be fine, knowing that his sister was going through this other thing at that moment, all of these things. He was having the extra neural experience of connectedness to everything because he was stepping back into his full awareness of I am beyond particle. I am in an energy state. I am an energy being. I am, starlight more than I am a physical body. And so that's the transition he was starting to experience. And the white light that I've seen all of my patients step in and away from, like they'll go across the veil, they'll see the white light, they come back, said, I saw a white light, I heard this thing, saw my grandma, blah, blah, blah. All of these things, the white light, I'm increasingly believe is you're seeing your own energy field. As you move into the white light, that's not necessarily something that we would call Jesus or these other stories you hear talked about at the bedside by the chaplain. It's actually the light that you are coming into your own lightness. And then through that light, you might connect to Christ consciousness or anything else going on around you that you want to use your spiritual worldview to express. But remember, your spiritual worldview is relying on an English language here and a human history of a couple thousand years. Like that can't explain eons of energy. So embrace your religious worldview, but understand it's just a fractal of this spiritual reality of energy fields that have been there since the beginning of time and are organized with great love and are organized around beauty. So in these last few minutes, I do want to dive into this topic of beauty a little bit and think about that. I was looking through some of the Q&A here, and I know there's a ton of questions we haven't answered yet, with 224 questions there, but we've answered a few of them in the course of them. One of them that's really pertinent to the mind, and this is going to be a trigger for fear. So I want you to understand here, I'm taking you from a state of flow. I'm taking you from this state of high expanded energy, and now I'm going to trigger fear. So I want you to feel the difference between a state of excitement, curiosity, creativity, and the RAS system activating. The question that I'm going to answer here for a second is, what is the effect of the vaccines on the neural system? And so I'll try to answer part of that, but then Dr. Willeumier, if you got some more insights there, and Dr. Cummings, I'd love for you guys to both jump in to add more depth to this one, because I think it's forefront of everybody's mind right now. It's one of the most polarizing questions that is present in our country right now, and frankly in the world, is, am I going to be vaccinated or not? So what is the vaccine? If you want to deep dive on this, please go back to the last seminar, which was GMO, Engineering Nature Out of Humanity. Look at if you can't handle the 3 hours, I don't blame you. Nobody can actually really handle 3 hours and be talking, but go to the last 30 minutes and get the deep dive on the vaccines and what is actually happening to this genetic engineering that we're calling vaccines. And what the cliff notes is that when you are injected with either our messenger RNA or the DNA, of one of these vaccines, your body starts making a spike protein. And the spike protein is a neurovascular toxin. If you are in a state of disrepair with your immune system and your regulatory systems and your relationship to the virome, and you're exposed to SARS-CoV-2, which is a new variant of an ancient coronavirus, your symptoms are likely to be neural and vascular. And so you're going to get neurotoxicity in the form of loss of taste, loss of smell, and you're going to get neural loss with tingling in the toes, fingers, which can be prolonged. For many people, it takes a few months to recover this neurologic injury from this. And interestingly, it is the spike protein in its overexpression that triggers this toxin event. It is a toxin. So bizarrely, coronavirus as a genome, as a viral genetic code, does very little to give us any problems. It's a very benign update to RNA information. What can happen though is if we overexpress this spike protein, then we can develop neurotoxicity from getting the illness. Bizarrely, when it came time to genetically engineer, for the first time, humanity to try to protect us from this virus, we picked the toxin to produce. And so we, for one reason or another, and I don't want to go into any speculation as to why we did this, but we picked the toxin that is made by the virus, which is the spike protein, which is a neurovascular toxin, to make your body build. And so when you get that injection, you are going to start producing a neurovascular toxin in your body. And Dr. Bridle, Byron Bridle, did a nice summary of this. He's very much described himself as a pro-vaccine doctor, but on the air, I think, is the program that he debuted all this new science that was breaking, which is the sudden terror among the pro-vax group that spike protein was leaving the shoulder, which honestly, from a science standpoint, I don't know how anybody thought this was going to be isolated to the shoulder where you injected that thing. But let's do the magical thinking that we believed for a moment that somehow we were going to inject this stuff into a shoulder and it was going to be magically compartmentalized in the shoulder and wouldn't go into the bloodstream and course all over the body. But anyway, he was in shock and awe on this on the air show, sharing a bunch of data coming in from around the world, from researchers all over the world, sharing terrifying data that the spike protein was being made all over the body. The spike protein was being made in liver cells, pancreas, brain. Like, oh my God, this mRNA, these DNA engineering things are turning on protein synthesis of spike proteins in potentially every single organ of the body, which we know it's a toxin. And he goes into very clear detail that this is a neurovascular toxin. We thought it was going to be made locally and then you'd get an antibody response. It's actually going to every organ of the body and starting to make spike protein. And so the scary thing about the possibility of now vaccinating or genetically engineering the entire world to start making a neurovascular toxin gives us an example of just how short-sighted we are with this whole pandemic response and how short-sighted we are with the ways in which nature balances itself with us. And so we need to have a universal respect for nature, and we need to stop mucking with the engineering of how we stay in balance with viruses, for sure. But take note that this is a neuro injury. And so I want you to go grab Dr. Willumier's book and dive into Peter's book on Brainwashed as well. So Biohack Your Brain and Brainwashed, two great books to look at of like, we all need to start re-engineering our brain right now, because if you've been vaccinated or you plan to be vaccinated, you are going to be producing a neurovascular toxin in your body. You need to be prepared for that. You need to be proactive and get yourself into a state of immunity and a state of resilience and regenerative capacity that can go down this. If you want a lot of science around the actin and how the microbiome rebuilds this resiliency, you can go to Ion Biome and all of our company's stuff there, because we're very passionate about how do you build resilience in neural systems. And the answer is bizarre. It's not by helping the human cell, it's by helping the microbiome. And by helping the microbiome explode in its communication network and metabolic activity, you actually immediately improve actin expression, reduce reactive oxygen species stress, you radically increase protein synthesis across the board. So very exciting reality that the microbiome is there to support you. So in this, I want to finish out this last few minutes to imagine a world now. This is where we get to co-create a world right now together where the universe that we know now is irrelevant. The fear that you now have over vaccines or no vaccines, the fear that you have right now over SARS or no SARS, the fear that you have over where your children go on to be successful or not successful, will they go to university, not university, will they have ADHD or not, will they get over their autism spectrum, will it be a superpower, will it be a disability, all of these things that are right now coursing through your mind and tugging you in both directions. Let's let go of all of that and give Dr. Willeumier and then Dr. Cummings a moment to express something about what you guys have witnessed about beauty. This has become a North Star for me. Beauty is a metric that I think needs to become the most important evaluation of whether we're going in the right direction as a species or not, is what we are creating beautiful. And if it is not beautiful, we know we immediately can stop spending energy in that direction and let's move forward. Certainly a anti-vax, pro-vax argument is not beautiful. It's one of the most pathetic things that I have to engage in all the time is that discussion, and it's exhausting and it sucks my energy down. I want to be in an extraneural state. I want to be in this extended space where I am concentrating on the potential of total beauty. And so I want to pose a question to you both, which is, we know through neuroimaging and through all of the neuroscience out there that we use a tiny, tiny fraction of our brain. And so when we go about describing, well, here's the RAS system and here's the sympathetic system, or here's the amygdala, or we describe all these different parts of the brain, all we're doing is describing the parts that we understand. We're describing the activity within the 10% of the neurons that we might have started to map out now. With the 90%, what do you think we're supposed to connect to? Dr. Willeumier, what do you think our potential of connectivity outside of the brain is with this 90% of the brain? When we talk about using the rest of the brain, how are we going to access that? And where is the beauty that you see around you that maybe gives you an opportunity to start to use that other 90%?
Wow, everything you've just said right now, I mean, I'm taking it all in from what Dr. Pete went through with his experience. You know, now you're talking about the vaccines, then beauty. There's a lot to unpack there.
And I'm glad you're going first and answering this.
Yeah, well, you know, truth be told, and maybe I'm going to do the 50,000 foot view on this again and bring it back to a place of peace and giving peace of mind, you know, and maybe going back to even the spiritual piece, because we have been, you know, in this fear state because of the pandemic. As Dr. Pete was saying, his, 102-year-old, was it your grandma, Dr. Pete? Who's like, I've never seen anything like this. And she's been through the Depression and world wars. So we've all been through this very challenging time. Then we have Dr. Pete talk about this extraordinary near-death experience where he has come back a changed man. He has let his ego self go, which, you know, being a doctor in my field, right, we're all about accomplishments, and he has connected to the more spiritual elements of who he is, and his heart and his family and his community and his love of community. And here we have Dr. Bush, who really, you know, widened the spectrum to talk about how we are light beings, you know, and really connected to that vibrational energy of who we are. And yes, we have this brain, and you know, the brain helps direct this extraordinary energy that's coming through the body, and we get to decide how we want to use that energy on a daily basis. I wrote Biohack Your Brain, just a little thing about the brain, to teach you ways to consciously direct your energy so that we can have a healthy brain, a healthy vascular system, a healthy neurological system. Even if you decide to do the vaccine, if you don't decide to do the vaccine, it's even your thought process on it. If you decide to take the vaccine and you feel like it's going to help you and provide immunity, just the power of your mind, the thought fractal of your mind, feeling that that is a positive for you, can actually help to mitigate some of the other effects that Zach was talking about. So I just want to leave you with a piece of advice. Your mind is powerful, your thoughts are powerful, your daily actions are powerful. We have a short period of time on this earth, you know, actually, well, you know, we've now shown we can start extending lifespan, but, you know, as Dr. Zach had talked about, you know, we've got new assaults that are on our body coming from the glyphosate, all the way from, you know, the days of my father in Vietnam and Agent Orange to now it's, you know, in all of the foods we eat. It wasn't in the foods that my father ate, but it's in the foods that we are eating and the foods that our kids are consuming. And I think we have to be really vigilant about that. I want to bring in a point to say the foods that we are eating can really help determine if we are going to accelerate brain aging or slow brain aging. We now know following a Mediterranean style diet can slow cognitive aging by as much as 7.5 years. Now imagine you follow a Mediterranean diet, keep your sugars between, you know, 25 to 35 grams per day. Do not eat GMOs, do not have pesticides. You know, with my dad, you know, because of what he went through, I don't eat anything that isn't organic and locally grown. Connecting with nature and the vibration of nature and whole foods that actually have a vibration and a frequency that helps the frequency of your cells. So if we're going to go there on this kind of forum, I will speak like this. This is why the whole food, plant-based, diets are really a smart strategy to support your long-term brain health, protect you from degenerative diseases, keeping the levels of beta amyloid plaque down. So again, I could probably talk for an hour ad lib, but I just want to close and say you are a powerful creator. Your brain is extraordinary. We can channel this extraordinary energy we have to do whatever we want to accomplish, whether you are on the spectrum with autism spectrum disorder, whether you have bipolar disorder, like my godfather who ran companies successfully and is still living a joyous life. We can choose how we want to perceive our life. We can perceive it with joy and beauty. We could perceive the fears. If you're having trouble in your perception of life, this is why we have therapists and cognitive behavioral therapy and so many amazing strategies and people who can help support you in getting to your healthiest brain function possible. And I think what I wanted to leave you with, and I know Zach had talked about this, here I studied neurons. I literally studied neurons that were in addition, had to keep them alive for 10 years, right? 10 years of my career. And I really appreciated how exquisite and beautiful these neurons were. And I got to see what we call synaptic plasticity live in culture. And I got to watch these neurons make processes with their neighbors. So I have a visual representation in my brain of what that means. When talking about brain aging, yes, I talked about the brain shrinking and the hippocampus shrinking. One of the beautiful things is our brain has the capacity to make new neurons in the hippocampus up until our 8th, 9th, centenarians. So we can continue to make new neurons, right, as we age. And this concept of neuroplasticity, meaning our neurons can make new connections, that happens throughout the lifespan. And that is what is going to keep us cognitively sharp. So in closing, let's keep our stress levels down. Let's not panic whether we've taken a vaccine or not. Keep it all in the positive. Remember, our journey here on Earth is short. Let's make it the best we possibly can. Live each day with love and connectedness. Enjoy the beauty of nature, our pets, our animals, our family, our global family. And I just wanted to say what an honor it has been to join you in your community, to be welcomed into this community. It is my great honor to have served you here today. Pete?
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Thank you, Kristen.
What she said. I want to say everything she said. That was beautiful. I think when we start thinking about the brain and using this idea that we're only use 10% of it, that is a measurement by tools that we currently have. There is another 90% that we don't know how to look at yet. We didn't know how to look at measure radio waves coming from the sun until we learned how to build a radio telescope. So there are things going on in the brain that we have yet to even be able to look at in science yet. So until we can do that, understanding how that other 90% works, we have no idea. It's doing something. It isn't there for nothing, and it's vital. It's getting blood flow. So we need to think about what those things do in a different context than writing and running and doing the things that become part of our daily life. And one of the things I often wonder about, and this may be a bit out there, but ties into what you're saying, Zach, about beings of light, and I truly believe that. There are so many components of our cells, like the mitochondria, the absolute essence of our existence, has numerous components to it that are light sensitive. And we know that photobiomodulation, whether it's laser or light therapy, affects human biology. Being in the sunshine isn't just for vitamin D and tanning, it really improves our immune function. And we need light. And I think that when you look at the brain in that regard and what it's doing, what the other 90% is doing, is the way that the human brain thinks and does things. The electrical and the chemical conduction of nerve function is way too slow to explain what the human brain is able to do. And I've often wondered if axons with microtubules, which are part of the structure of the neurons, if they're not fiber optics, and that actually a lot of the biophoto functions in the brain and a lot of our thoughts and brain activities, actually the production of light and transmission of light through our brains using microtubules and this protein tau which is so very important. And that is a vibration, what you're talking about. And if you take that the next step further to something you said, Zach, if you think about the eyes, the nose, and the ears, all those nerves in our face are designed to go into our limbic system of our brain, which is the fight or flight area. And the eyes, the ears, and the nose are incredibly tied to emotional learning. It's why when you see something, it reminds you of somebody and you feel an emotion. You hear a song, it reminds you of something and you feel an emotion. You smell something, smell perfume, it reminds you of your grandmother. Those are senses that are directly tied to emotion. And if what you're feeding your eyes, your ears, and your nose is garbage, then you're going to tap into negative emotions. And the key, I think, is to focus on the beautiful, to get outside. I do my best clear thinking in the morning, walking the dog in the woods for an hour every day, and get out and see the beauty, and don't get what I say, the distraction of the dramatic, the bad news, the scary things that focus your attention. It's very much like a magic trick where the magician is moving their hand around and you're watching it like a cat looking at a toy, but the trick is happening in the other hand you're not watching. And life is like that. If you're too focused on the distractions, life is happening over here and you're missing it. And so start paying attention to what's not going on. Broaden what you're feeding your eyes, nose, and ears, in your mouth. The food you put into your body, the sounds you put into your body, the sights you put into your body are vital to your health, not just physical health, but emotional health, spiritual health. And to start thinking about it that way, and connecting that into the idea that with your vibration and light, Zach, that the part of the problem is we confuse awareness and consciousness. You're conscious of something, meaning you're awareness of it. They're not. Awareness is you're aware of it. Consciousness is that other thing. And part of the problem we've had with the brain is we're trying to, and it's been since Plato, trying to, and Aristotle, trying to find out where the center of consciousness was in the brain. And that's not the way to think about it, because it doesn't exist in the brain. We don't produce consciousness. We receive consciousness. And it's through the vibrations that you're talking about in the universe. It's like those, have you ever seen those sound machines they put they put sand on a glass plate and they put speakers underneath them and they form these incredible shapes with sound that they're shapes. You can see them. They're not random sand bouncing all around like somebody running on the beach. That's consciousness. And our brain receives that pattern of vibration that is what is out in the universe. We're not making it, we're receiving it, and we're part of it, like a radio wave, and everybody's radio in the street can pick up on the same song. The other thing I would say is, the last 2 points I'll make is that if you want to think about the beauty of life, I like to use the analogy of what's the point of music? To listen to it. What's the point of life? To live it. And no amount of guilt is going to repair your past. No amount of worry is going to transform your future. Put the value and the importance on where you are right now and live life. I tell medical students, hey, you may be the smartest person in the world. You may think you're going to cure cancer. You're going to have a great career, but live your life. Your accomplishments are not your life. Your accomplishments are not who you are. Who you are is where you are in this exact moment, and try to spend more time there. And the way you do that is by feeding yourself those really important things. And we went into the last point I'll make is the blog that we wrote on this topic has got some really good actionable points on how to do things. I think more about that. A really short sort of description of how to take care of yourself. And it really is a summary of everything we've done so far. I pulled things out of all of our blogs. So if you want to get even more detail, go read all the previous blogs and then go get Kristen's book, because then you biohack your brain to spiritual and emotional and physical health and live a happy, wonderful life, or whatever you got here. And again, I'm so thankful to be here and be able to talk about this stuff with these people, and to hear Kristen today is very special to see two incredible worlds of mine colliding and having it be such a beautiful experience. It gives me a tremendous amount of pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. That was so rich, both of you. Those were such extraordinary moments there. Thank you for the wisdom in there. And for me, I think about that aging brain, perhaps because we each on this call have one. We each have aging brains, and as our hippocampus shrinks and we start to lose connectivity to our memories in that short-term memory kind of complex that the hippocampus is responsible for, how beautiful is it that perhaps this is the origin of wisdom, when we stop basing our beliefs of reality on our memories and start to base our sense of reality on something greater than ourselves. And so I believe that other 90% of the brain, at least a large portion of that, is the roots of wisdom. And if we start to imagine neurons not just as trees, but as root systems into this energy field, into this consciousness environment around us, I would expand your mind to become that root system. And so if you want a meditation to close with here, I would close your eyes and imagine yourself expanding into the universe right now. The neural network in your brain is literally this grand forest, this jungle of activity that's now reaching out, not towards you and towards your experiences and your sensory belief systems, but actually reaching now out into the air around you, down into the earth below you, out into the cosmos at large. Reach your neural network out. Start to connect to something greater than your own perception, because it's so limited in its capacity. It only has human eyes. It only has a human nose. It only has the human tongue to taste the world and love the beauty around it. Let go of those human sensory experiences and reach the other 90% of your brain into the greater environment. What would Mother Earth teach us about the world that we will create with her now? What technology will our autistic children create when we stop handing them iPads and hand them a forest? What will they create out of that with their ingenious minds, their dewired, deprogrammed potential? What will they create? We need to take the technology out of their hands, because that was what we created with our sensory experience. We need a non-sensory stimulus for our autistic children who are dialed into the theta wave. They are in this high creative state. We need to take the technology out of their hands long enough that they could imagine a different future where communication is not through 5G, but is through telepathic pathways of the mycelium beneath our feet. And we can send vibrations and light energy through the fiber optic cables below our feet, so that we could communicate through mushrooms and fungi rather than through 5G towers. Could we imagine a point where sensuality is beyond the human senses? Can we remind our children by the beat of a drum by a fire that we came from the origin of stories in the dark under the stars, and the vibration between the fire and the stars above us sent light energy into our bodies, and that we would have a creative night of dreaming that would not stop when we awoke, but we lived a life of dreaming? We differentiate the indigenous experience from the Western modern experience in that the dream state is continuous in the former. There was no necessity to stop dreaming during the day. We are so distracted by the RAS, by that fight or flight state during the day, we forget to stay in the dream state. And so not just good sleep, but good dreaming. I want your daydreaming to kick off now with your roots sent out into the universe. You are a figment of Mother Nature's imagination, and here you are. You showed up right now at the tipping point of all the things, all the crap we're doing to the planet, all the beauty that we're creating together. We're here at the tipping point. In Peter's words, we are right now. There is no future that is relevant. There is no past that's relevant. We are at a new now. And this new now, if informed by something greater than human consciousness, human perception, and we start to tap into this greater universe, we will become potent. For the first time, humanity will step into its full potential, and we will create a different world for us. And we will avert that sixth grade extinction to create life abundantly. And we will participate in a new virome that is more intelligent than the genetics of the planet have ever been, because of the extinction level stress. Nature always responds to stress in an acute inflammatory way, where it's stronger, not weaker at the end of it. Mother Nature is not out of her coping mechanisms. We may trigger the sixth extinction, and she will recover, and she will do it beautifully. And she will create something more intelligent and complex than exists on the planet today. This is the future, and we get to have a participation in that if we choose to change everything. But to do it, we're going to have to tap into the 90% of our brain that we are not aware of. It is active, like Peter said. It is getting blood flow. It has metabolic activity. It's ready to go. So grow your roots deep, and let's manifest that new future. Thank you for being with us today. Dr. Willeumier, you are a light to all of us. Thank you for your wisdom. Dr. Peter Cummings, you are a rock star. Thank you for all of your work on the blogs and the support and everything else. It has been an absolute joy to be with all of you. Thank you to the tens of thousands that will tune in when your time zones around the world allow for it. We're so grateful for your participation in this community. We know that there's 360 questions sitting there that I probably did not address, but we are very excited that your curiosity is sparked, and we want you to know that we are not the source of your knowledge, but your curiosity will drive you to your answers. And so whether it be over the vaccines or over anything other there that is driving in your mind, open up to the possibility that the answers are not in my brain that you're looking for. The answers that you're looking for are in your access to the field of consciousness as you use that extra neural capacity within you. Let's go forth and conquer and make something really beautiful happen as we let go of the old arguments, the old polarizations, and become one. Thank you all.